The federal courthouse at Foley Square in Lower Manhattan stood 7 stories tall on the morning of March 14, 1952. The building's limestone facade faced east toward the rising sun, which at 8:30 that morning cast long shadows across the plaza, where lawyers, defendants, and witnesses gathered before hearings. The temperature stood at 42 degrees, cold enough that most people wore overcoats. Inside, the third-floor courtroom where Judge Edward Demock presided over federal criminal cases had been designed in the classical style, with dark wood paneling, brass fixtures, and rows of wooden benches for spectators. The American flag hung beside the judge's bench, and the seal of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York occupied the wall behind it. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson entered the courtroom at 8:45, accompanied by his attorney, a man named Harold Rothman, who had practiced criminal defense in New York for 18 years. Johnson was 46 years old that spring, dressed in a dark suit that had been cleaned and pressed the previous day. His white shirt was buttoned at the collar, and his shoes showed polish, but also the wear of regular use. The distinctive bump on the back of his head remained visible beneath his short-cropped hair. He walked with steady steps to the defense table and sat in the chair Rothman indicated, placing his hands on the table in front of him. The courtroom filled gradually over the next 15 minutes. Federal prosecutors occupied the table to Johnson's left. Behind them sat several agents from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the agency that had conducted the investigation leading to Johnson's indictment. The gallery held approximately 30 people, including several reporters from newspapers that covered organized crime, a few associates of Johnson's who had come to observe the proceedings, and various members of the public interested in the case. At 9 o'clock precisely, Judge Demock entered through a door behind the bench. Everyone stood. The judge took his seat and instructed everyone else to sit. The clerk called the case. United States of America versus Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws. The proceeding that morning was a pretrial hearing to address several motions filed by the defense regarding evidence the government intended to introduce at trial. The lead prosecutor, an assistant United States attorney named Robert Henderson, stood and addressed the court. He explained that the government's case rested on testimony from multiple witnesses who would describe Johnson's role in a heroin distribution network operating in Harlem. These witnesses included informants who had participated in drug transactions with Johnson, law enforcement officers who had conducted surveillance, and experts who would testify about the quantities and value of drugs involved. Henderson stated that the government also possessed physical evidence, including seized heroin, financial records, and various documents that demonstrated the scope of the conspiracy. Then Henderson mentioned one additional piece of evidence. The government had obtained a recording of Johnson's voice through what Henderson described as lawful surveillance conducted pursuant to proper authorization. The recording, Henderson said, captured Johnson discussing heroin transactions with another individual. The government intended to introduce this recording at trial as evidence of Johnson's knowing participation in the drug conspiracy. Harold Rothman stood immediately and requested that the court hear argument on the admissibility of this recording. Judge Demock agreed and instructed both sides to be prepared to address the issue that afternoon following the lunch recess. Johnson sat motionless during these exchanges, his expression revealing nothing. He had been arrested on these charges 4 months earlier, in November 1951. The indictment alleged that he had conspired with others to distribute heroin in New York City during the previous 3 years. Johnson had maintained from the moment of his arrest that he was innocent, that the charges were fabricated, that he had been targeted by law enforcement because of his prominence in Harlem rather than because of any actual criminal activity. Many people in Harlem believed Johnson's claims of innocence. He had been a fixture in the neighborhood for 2 decades, operating policy banks and managing various gambling operations under an arrangement with the Italian mob that had existed since 1935. While these activities were illegal, they were viewed by many Harlem residents as acceptable forms of economic activity that provided employment and entertainment without the devastating social costs associated with drugs like heroin. Johnson had built a reputation as someone who protected Harlem's economic interests, who contributed to community welfare, who helped families in need. The idea that he would involve himself in heroin distribution seemed inconsistent with his established pattern of operations. But the federal government clearly believed otherwise, and the mention of a recording suggested they possessed evidence beyond witness testimony. After the morning session concluded and the court recessed for lunch, Johnson met with Rothman in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse's main corridor. Rothman explained that the existence of a recording presented serious problems. If the recording actually captured Johnson's voice discussing heroin transactions, it would be far more persuasive to a jury than witness testimony alone. Witnesses could be cross-examined, their credibility could be challenged, their motives could be questioned. But a recording of Johnson's own voice would be difficult to refute. Johnson asked how the government had obtained such a recording. Rothman said he did not know the specifics yet, but that the afternoon session would presumably provide more details. He noted that surveillance techniques had become more sophisticated in recent years, that law enforcement agencies had begun using electronic listening devices to monitor suspected criminals, and that courts had generally upheld the admissibility of such recordings as long as proper procedures had been followed. The afternoon session began at 2 o'clock. Prosecutor Henderson rose and provided the court with additional information about the recording. He explained that in August 1951, acting on information from a confidential informant, federal agents had obtained authorization to install a listening device in a social club on 132nd Street in Harlem. The authorization had come from a supervising official within the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Henderson said, and the installation had been conducted in accordance with agency procedures. The device had remained active for approximately 6 weeks, during which time it had captured numerous conversations. One of these conversations, occurring on September 15, 1951, involved Johnson speaking with another individual about the distribution of heroin in Harlem. Henderson told the court that the government possessed the recording on magnetic tape and was prepared to have it transcribed and authenticated by the agents who had conducted the surveillance. He argued that the recording met all requirements for admissibility. It had been obtained pursuant to proper authorization. It was relevant to the charges in the indictment. It was authentic, and its probative value outweighed any potential prejudicial effect. Rothman stood and requested that the court review the specific authorization under which the listening device had been installed. He argued that without seeing the actual authorization document, the defense could not assess whether proper procedures had been followed. He also requested that the court require the government to produce the full recording, not just the portion they intended to introduce at trial, so that the defense could evaluate the context of any statements Johnson might have made. Judge Dimmock agreed that these were reasonable requests and instructed the government to produce the authorization documents and the complete recording within 3 days. The court would then schedule another hearing to determine admissibility. The session concluded at 3:15, and Johnson left the courthouse with Rothman, walking north toward Harlem without speaking. Johnson understood that what had occurred in that courtroom represented something more significant than a simple evidentiary dispute. The government was claiming to have recorded his voice without his knowledge, to have listened to his private conversations, to have monitored his activities through electronic surveillance. This represented a level of intrusion and control that went beyond traditional policing methods. It suggested that the boundaries between public and private, between what the government could observe and what remained beyond their reach, had shifted in ways that fundamentally altered the balance of power between the state and the individual. Over the next 3 days, Johnson met repeatedly with Rothman to discuss the implications of the recording and to develop a strategy for challenging it. Rothman explained that the law regarding electronic surveillance was evolving. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protected against unreasonable searches and seizures, but courts had not yet definitively resolved whether electronic surveillance constituted a search requiring a warrant. Some courts had held that as long as agents did not physically trespass on private property, electronic surveillance did not violate the Fourth Amendment. Other courts had begun questioning this reasoning, suggesting that the right to privacy extended beyond protection against physical intrusion. Rothman also explained that even if the surveillance itself was lawful, there might be procedural defects in how it had been authorized or conducted. Federal regulations required that electronic surveillance be approved by senior officials, that the authorizations specify the target and purpose of the surveillance, that the duration be limited, and that irrelevant conversations not be recorded or be immediately destroyed. If the government had violated any of these requirements, the recording might be excluded from evidence. Johnson listened carefully to these explanations, but he was thinking beyond the immediate legal questions. He recognized that if the government could install listening devices in social clubs and private spaces throughout Harlem, the entire structure of how criminal organizations operated would need to change. Traditional security measures, using trusted associates, meeting in secure locations, speaking carefully about sensitive matters, would become insufficient if law enforcement could simply listen to conversations electronically. The technological capabilities of the state were expanding in ways that created new forms of vulnerability. But Johnson also recognized that these same technological capabilities created potential weaknesses in the government's case. Electronic recordings could be manipulated, they could be taken out of context. They could capture statements that seemed incriminating, but which had innocent explanations. They could be of poor quality, making identification of speakers uncertain, and most importantly, the government's reliance on electronic surveillance might make them overconfident, might cause them to neglect other aspects of their case, might create opportunities for the defense to expose flaws in their investigation. 3 days after the afternoon hearing, As instructed by Judge Dimmock, the government produced documents to the defense. Rothman reviewed these documents carefully and then met with Johnson to explain what they revealed. The authorization for the electronic surveillance had been signed by a supervisor in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in Washington, D.C. The authorization specified that a listening device was to be installed in a social club at a specific address on 132nd Street, that the purpose was to gather evidence of narcotics trafficking, and that the surveillance was authorized for a period of 60 days. The government had also produced a transcript of the recording they intended to introduce. The transcript purported to capture a conversation between two individuals identified as Speaker 1 and Speaker 2. Speaker 1 was claimed to be Ellsworth Johnson. The conversation included references to quantities, prices, and distribution methods that could be interpreted as relating to heroin trafficking, though the transcript never used the word heroin explicitly. Instead, the speakers referred to merchandise, packages, and delivery schedules. Rothman pointed out several problems with what the government had produced. First, the authorization document was vague about how the government had determined that narcotics trafficking was occurring at that specific location. It referenced a confidential informant, but provided no details about the informant's reliability or the specific information they had provided. Second, the government had not produced the actual recording on magnetic tape, only a transcript. This meant the defense could not verify the accuracy of the transcription, could not hear the voices to confirm identification, could not assess the quality of the recording or whether it had been edited. Third, the transcript showed only a fragment of the conversation, approximately 3 minutes, with no indication of what had been said before or after those 3 minutes. Johnson asked whether these problems would be sufficient to have the recording excluded. Rothman said he was uncertain. The law in this area was unsettled, and different judges approached these issues differently. Some might find the procedural defects serious enough to warrant exclusion. Others might allow the recording to be admitted and leave it to the jury to assess its weight and credibility. The hearing scheduled for the following week would be critical. That evening, Johnson began implementing a strategy that extended beyond the courtroom. He recognized that even if the recording was excluded from his trial, the government's use of electronic surveillance represented a broader threat to Harlem's criminal networks. If law enforcement could monitor social clubs and gather evidence through listening devices, many of the established patterns of operation would become dangerous. Associates would be at risk of prosecution. Business discussions would be vulnerable to interception. The entire infrastructure of communication and coordination would need to be rethought. Johnson began meeting with other operators in Harlem who were affected by the same surveillance threat. These included numbers, bankers, bookmakers, and various individuals who managed illegal enterprises. He explained that the government had expanded its surveillance capabilities and that everyone needed to adapt their operations accordingly. This meant being more cautious about where sensitive conversations occurred, being more careful about what was said, even in seemingly private settings, and developing alternative methods of communication that did not rely on traditional face-to-face meetings in fixed locations. Johnson also reached out to legitimate community organizations in Harlem, including ministers, civil rights activists, and political leaders. He explained that federal law enforcement was conducting electronic surveillance in Harlem without meaningful oversight, that listening devices were being installed in private spaces without warrants or court approval, and that this represented a violation of privacy rights that affected not just criminals, but the entire community. He framed this as a civil liberties issue, arguing that government surveillance without proper legal constraints was a threat to everyone's freedom. Several ministers agreed to address the issue of government surveillance in their Sunday sermons. Reverend Marcus Hayes, who led a large Baptist congregation, devoted a portion of his sermon to the importance of privacy and the dangers of unchecked government power. He did not mention Johnson's case specifically, but he spoke about how law enforcement agencies were increasingly monitoring black communities without adequate justification or oversight. He called for political action to establish legal protections against surveillance abuses. Other community leaders began circulating information about surveillance practices and organizing meetings to discuss how to respond. The issue gained attention in Harlem's newspapers, with several articles questioning whether federal agencies were respecting constitutional rights in their investigations of criminal activity in black neighborhoods. Politicians who represented Harlem began receiving questions from constituents about surveillance practices, and some of these politicians began making inquiries with federal agencies. Simultaneously, Rothman was developing the legal strategy for the upcoming hearing on the admissibility of the recording. He prepared arguments on multiple grounds. First, he would argue that the authorization for the surveillance was insufficient because it lacked specificity about the information that justified installing a listening device at that particular location. Second, he would argue that the government's failure to produce the actual recording on magnetic tape violated the defense's right to examine and challenge the evidence. Third, he would argue that even if the surveillance authorization was technically adequate, the government had exceeded its scope by recording conversations over a 6-week period without obtaining renewed authorization. The hearing occurred on March 24, 1952, 10 days after the initial mention of the recording. Judge Dimmock's courtroom was again filled with observers, including several reporters and community members interested in the surveillance issue. Prosecutor Henderson argued first, reiterating that the surveillance had been properly authorized, and that the recording was reliable evidence of Johnson's participation in narcotics trafficking. He told the court that the government was prepared to have the agents who conducted the surveillance testify about the technical aspects of the recording process and to authenticate Johnson's voice. Rothman then presented the defense arguments. He emphasized that the government's authorization document was remarkably vague, providing no real evidence that narcotics trafficking was occurring at the location where the listening device was installed. He noted that the informant whose information supposedly justified the surveillance remained unidentified, and that the defense had no opportunity to test the reliability of that informant's claims. He argued that this lack of specificity meant the surveillance was essentially a fishing expedition, an attempt to gather evidence by monitoring a location where Johnson was known to meet with associates, rather than a targeted investigation of specific criminal activity. Rothman also emphasized the government's failure to produce the actual recording. He argued that a transcript was inherently unreliable, that it represented someone's interpretation of what was said rather than the original evidence, and that without the ability to hear the recording, the defense could not meaningfully challenge its accuracy or authenticity. He noted that voice identification from an audio recording required expert analysis, not simply an agent's claim that he recognized Johnson's voice. He argued that the quality of the recording, the presence of background noise, the possibility of multiple speakers talking over each other, all of these factors could affect the reliability of the transcription and the identification of speakers. Finally, Rothman argued that the surveillance had exceeded its authorized scope. The authorization had specified 60 days, but the government had not obtained renewed authorization after that period expired. Yet they were attempting to introduce evidence from conversations that may have been recorded after the authorization period ended. This suggested that the government viewed electronic surveillance as something that could continue indefinitely once initiated, rather than as a limited investigative tool subject to ongoing judicial or administrative oversight. Judge Dimmock listened carefully to both sides and then took the matter under advisement, saying he would issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. The hearing concluded, and Johnson left the courthouse with Rothman, again walking north toward Harlem. During the 2 weeks while they awaited Judge Dimmock's ruling, Johnson continued his broader campaign to raise awareness about surveillance issues. The community organizing that had begun with ministers' sermons had expanded into a more coordinated effort. A coalition of civil rights organizations, church groups, and political activists began calling for legislative hearings on federal surveillance practices in New York. They drafted a petition demanding that Congress establish clear legal standards for electronic surveillance, requiring warrants based on probable cause rather than allowing agencies to authorize surveillance internally without judicial oversight. This political pressure created complications for the federal prosecutors handling Johnson's case. The broader public debate about surveillance practices made it more difficult for them to argue that their methods were clearly lawful and appropriate. If the community was raising serious questions about whether surveillance without warrants violated constitutional rights, judges might be more skeptical about admitting evidence obtained through such surveillance. On April 7, 1952, Judge Dimmock issued his ruling. The decision ran 12 pages and addressed each of the defense arguments in detail. The judge found that the authorization document was minimally adequate, that it provided some basis for believing narcotics trafficking was occurring at the specified location, even if the information was not as detailed as the defense might prefer. However, the judge also found significant problems with how the government had conducted the surveillance and with what they had produced to the defense. Specifically, Judge Dimmock ruled that the government's failure to produce the actual recording on magnetic tape was a serious defect. The judge wrote that in an era where technology allowed the government to secretly record private conversations, the accuracy and authenticity of such recordings must be subject to rigorous verification. A transcript alone was insufficient. The defense had the right to hear the actual recording, to have it examined by experts, to assess its quality and clarity, and to challenge whether the voices had been correctly identified. The judge ordered the government to produce the magnetic tape recording within 1 week. He stated that if the government failed to produce the recording, or if they claimed it no longer existed or had been damaged or destroyed, the transcript would be excluded from evidence. The judge also ordered that once the recording was produced, the defense would be allowed to retain a copy for expert analysis and that the trial would be postponed to allow sufficient time for such analysis to be completed. This ruling represented a significant victory for the defense, though not a complete one. The recording itself had not been excluded, but the government now faced difficult choices. They would need to produce the actual tape, which might reveal problems with the recording's quality or authenticity. They would need to allow defense experts to examine the tape, which might uncover evidence of editing or manipulation. And they would need to delay the trial, giving the defense additional time to prepare. 3 days after Judge Dimmock's ruling, Prosecutor Henderson filed a motion with the court. The motion stated that upon review, the government had determined that the magnetic tape recording had been damaged during storage and was no longer in usable condition. The motion explained that the tape had been stored in a government facility where temperature and humidity controls had malfunctioned, causing the magnetic coating on the tape to deteriorate. The government still possessed the physical tape, but playback was no longer possible. Therefore, the government requested that the court reconsider its ruling and allow the transcript to be admitted despite the unavailability of the original recording. Rothman immediately filed a response arguing that the government's claimed damage to the tape was suspiciously convenient, occurring only after the court had ordered its production. He argued that even if the damage was genuine, the government's failure to properly preserve crucial evidence should result in exclusion of the transcript. He noted that the defense had repeatedly requested the actual recording, that the government had delayed producing it, and that the claimed deterioration had occurred while the recording was in government custody. Under these circumstances, allowing the transcript would reward the government for its failure to preserve evidence and would deny the defense the ability to challenge the recording's authenticity. The court scheduled another hearing for April 18th to address this issue. At that hearing, the government produced the damaged magnetic tape and called a technical expert to testify about the deterioration. The expert explained that the magnetic coating had degraded to the point where playback was impossible, that this type of damage was consistent with exposure to heat and humidity, and that there was no indication the tape had been deliberately destroyed. Rothman cross-examined the expert extensively, asking detailed questions about storage procedures, about when the damage had occurred, about whether the tape could have been copied before it deteriorated, about whether other tapes stored in the same facility had suffered similar damage. The expert's answers revealed several concerning facts. The tape had been stored in a facility that did not have climate controls adequate for preserving magnetic recordings. No other tapes in the facility had been examined to determine whether they had suffered similar damage. The government had not made any copies of the recording, despite knowing that it would be crucial evidence in the prosecution. After hearing this testimony, Judge Dimmock took the matter under advisement again. 5 days later, on April 23, 1952, he issued another written ruling. This decision was longer than the first, running 18 pages. The judge expressed skepticism about the timing of the tape's deterioration, noted that the government had failed to take reasonable steps to preserve important evidence, and concluded that allowing the transcript to be admitted would be fundamentally unfair to the defense. The judge wrote that electronic surveillance represented a powerful investigative tool that gave the government significant advantages in gathering evidence. But with that power came responsibility. If the government chose to rely on electronic recordings as evidence, they had an obligation to preserve those recordings in a manner that allowed the defense to examine and challenge them. The failure to do so could not be remedied by simply admitting a transcript, which was inherently less reliable and which the defense had no meaningful way to challenge. Therefore, Judge Dimmock ruled that the transcript would be excluded from evidence. The government would not be permitted to introduce any evidence derived from the electronic surveillance at Johnson's trial. This exclusion extended not only to the transcript itself, but also to any testimony from agents about what they had heard on the recording. This ruling represented a major setback for the prosecution. The case against Johnson was not destroyed. They still had witness testimony and other evidence, but they had lost what they clearly believed was their most persuasive evidence. Prosecutor Henderson immediately announced that the government needed time to reassess its case in light of the court's ruling. Over the following weeks, the dynamics of the case shifted significantly. Without the recording, the government's case rested primarily on testimony from informants and cooperating witnesses. Rothman's investigation into these witnesses revealed that several had significant credibility problems. Some had criminal records. Some had been paid by the government for their cooperation. Some had been promised favorable treatment in their own pending criminal cases in exchange for testifying against Johnson. Rothman began filing motions requesting detailed information about these witnesses, about the payments they had received, about any promises made to them, about their criminal histories. The government resisted these requests, arguing that providing such information would compromise ongoing investigations and would endanger the safety of cooperating witnesses. But Judge Dimmock, having already found serious problems with the government's handling of the surveillance evidence, was less inclined to defer to government claims about what needed to remain confidential. The judge ordered the government to produce information about payments to witnesses, about any agreements with witnesses regarding their cooperation, and about the criminal histories of any witness who would testify at trial. This information, when produced, revealed significant issues. Several witnesses had received thousands of dollars for their cooperation. Several had been promised that pending charges against them would be dismissed or reduced. Several had extensive histories of lying to law enforcement in previous cases. Armed with this information, Rothman began preparing for trial with increased confidence. The defense strategy would be to attack the credibility of each government witness systematically, to show the jury that these witnesses had strong incentives to lie, and to argue that the government's case was built on purchased testimony from unreliable criminals rather than on solid evidence. But before trial could begin, Prosecutor Henderson requested a meeting with Rothman to discuss the possibility of a plea agreement. This meeting occurred in early June 1952, nearly 3 months after the initial hearing about the recording. Henderson explained that the government remained confident in its case, but recognized that the exclusion of the recording and the credibility problems with some witnesses created uncertainty about the trial's outcome. The government was willing to offer Johnson a reduced sentence in exchange for a guilty plea. Rothman reported this offer to Johnson, who considered it carefully. A guilty plea would mean accepting a conviction and serving prison time, but it would also mean avoiding the risk of a much longer sentence if the jury convicted on all counts. After discussing the options with Rothman, Johnson made a strategic decision. He instructed Rothman to negotiate for the best possible terms, but to make clear that any agreement would need to include a specific sentence cap and would need to acknowledge that Johnson continued to maintain his innocence. The negotiations continued through June. The government initially proposed an 8-year sentence. Rothman countered with 3 years. They eventually reached an agreement at 5 years, with Johnson entering what is known as an Alford plea, a plea in which the defendant does not admit guilt, but acknowledges that the government has sufficient evidence to likely secure a conviction at trial. However, this agreement fell apart at the last moment when Johnson learned additional information about the recording that had supposedly been damaged. Through sources in Harlem who maintained relationships with various law enforcement officers, Johnson discovered that the tape had not actually deteriorated due to environmental factors. Instead, it had been deliberately recorded over with new content after Judge Dimmock's first ruling had required its production. Government agents, recognizing that the recording was of poor quality and that Johnson's voice might not be clearly identifiable, had decided to destroy the evidence rather than risk having their surveillance practices exposed as technically incompetent. Johnson brought this information to Rothman, who immediately filed a motion with the court requesting an investigation into whether the government had deliberately destroyed evidence. This motion included affidavits from individuals who claimed to have knowledge of the destruction. The motion argued that if the government had indeed deliberately destroyed the recording, they should be sanctioned and potentially the entire case should be dismissed. The filing of this motion created a crisis for the prosecution. If the allegations were true and could be proven, not only would Johnson's case be compromised, but federal prosecutors and agents could face serious professional consequences and potentially criminal charges for obstruction of justice. Henderson denied the allegations strenuously, but he also recognized that the court would need to conduct some form of inquiry. Judge Dimmock scheduled an evidentiary hearing for July 1952 to investigate the circumstances surrounding the tape's deterioration. This hearing extended over several days and involved testimony from multiple government agents, from technical experts, and from individuals who claimed to have knowledge about the deliberate destruction of evidence. The testimony revealed a complicated picture. Some witnesses supported Johnson's allegations, claiming that they had heard agents discussing the need to get rid of the recording because it was problematic. Other witnesses denied any deliberate destruction, maintaining that the tape had deteriorated naturally. The technical evidence was inconclusive. It was difficult to determine with certainty whether the damage to the tape had occurred through environmental factors or through deliberate recording over the original content. In August 1952, Judge Dimmock issued a ruling on the evidentiary hearing. The judge found that while there was some evidence supporting allegations of deliberate destruction, the evidence was not conclusive enough to make a definitive finding. However, the judge also found that the government's handling of the evidence had been so problematic, whether through negligence or deliberate action, that the case was fundamentally compromised. The judge strongly encouraged both sides to reach a negotiated resolution rather than proceeding to trial. Following this ruling, the government's negotiating position weakened significantly. In September 1952, a new plea agreement was reached. Johnson would plead guilty to a single count of conspiracy, would receive a sentence of 15 months, and would be given credit for time already served since his arrest. The agreement also included language stating that Johnson maintained his innocence but was accepting the plea to avoid the uncertainty and expense of trial. However, this agreement also fell through when Johnson refused to accept it. He had decided, after months of legal maneuvering and community organizing, that he would rather go to trial and risk a longer sentence than accept any guilty plea, even one that acknowledged his claimed innocence. This decision surprised both his attorney and the prosecutors, but Johnson had calculated that the government's case had been sufficiently weakened that a jury might acquit, and that even if convicted, the appeals process would provide additional opportunities to challenge the conviction. The trial finally began in November 1952. It lasted 3 weeks. The government presented testimony from multiple witnesses who claimed that Johnson had been involved in heroin distribution. Rothman cross-examined each witness aggressively, highlighting their criminal histories, their financial motivations for cooperating, and inconsistencies in their testimony. The defense presented witnesses who testified about Johnson's reputation in Harlem, about his legitimate business activities, and about his charitable work in the community. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On December 12, 1952, they returned a verdict of guilty on the conspiracy charge. However, the jury also submitted a recommendation for leniency, noting that they had found the government's witnesses to be of questionable credibility and that they had reached their verdict based on the cumulative weight of the evidence, rather than because any single piece of evidence had been convincing. Judge Dimmock sentenced Johnson to 15 years in federal prison, significantly longer than the plea agreement that had been discussed, but still within the statutory range. Johnson maintained his composure when the sentence was announced, showing no visible emotion. He was remanded to custody immediately and was transferred to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary several months later to begin serving his sentence. The story of the surveillance recording that was never played in court became part of the oral history of Harlem and of the broader discourse about government surveillance practices. The details were often distorted or exaggerated in the retelling, but certain facts remained consistent. The government had conducted electronic surveillance without a warrant, a recording had supposedly been made, the recording had been damaged or destroyed under suspicious circumstances, and Johnson had fought the use of that recording through legal challenges that had exposed significant problems with surveillance practices. The broader impact of Johnson's legal battle extended beyond his individual case. The publicity surrounding the surveillance issues contributed to growing public awareness about the expansion of government monitoring capabilities. Civil rights organizations began focusing more attention on surveillance practices in black communities, arguing that law enforcement agencies were using electronic monitoring as a tool of political control and social management rather than simply as a method for investigating specific crimes. In Congress, several members began introducing legislation aimed at regulating electronic surveillance and requiring judicial warrants before listening devices could be installed. While these early legislative efforts were not immediately successful, they established a foundation for future reforms. The arguments that had been developed in Johnson's case, that surveillance without judicial oversight violated constitutional rights, that the government could not be trusted to regulate its own surveillance practices, that the right to privacy extended to conversations even in semi-public spaces, became part of the evolving legal framework around electronic monitoring. Within law enforcement, Johnson's case became a cautionary tale about the importance of properly preserving evidence. The suspected deliberate destruction of the recording had created enormous problems for the prosecution and had damaged the credibility of the agents involved. Future surveillance operations placed greater emphasis on creating backup copies of recordings, on maintaining clear chains of custody, on documenting storage conditions, and on ensuring that evidence could survive legal challenges. For criminal operators in Harlem and elsewhere, Johnson's case demonstrated both the dangers and the vulnerabilities associated with electronic surveillance. The case showed that even seemingly private conversations could be monitored and recorded, making traditional methods of conducting illegal business more risky. But it also showed that surveillance evidence could be challenged, that the government's use of such evidence was subject to legal constraints, and that technical and procedural defects could render surveillance evidence useless. When Johnson was released from Alcatraz in 1963 after serving 11 years, he returned to Harlem as someone who had not only survived a lengthy prison sentence, but who had also fought a significant legal battle that had raised important questions about government power. The community remembered that he had challenged surveillance practices, that he had exposed problems with how evidence was collected and preserved, that he had refused to simply accept what the government claimed about their investigative methods. The 5 years between Johnson's release and his death in 1968 saw continued evolution in surveillance law. The Supreme Court's 1967 decision in Katz v. United States established that the Fourth Amendment protected people's reasonable expectations of privacy and that electronic surveillance constituted a search requiring a warrant. This decision vindicated many of the arguments that had been raised in Johnson's case 15 years earlier. Congress passed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which created a statutory framework for electronic surveillance requiring judicial authorization based on probable cause. These legal developments occurred too late to affect Johnson's case, but they demonstrated that the issues he had fought over had been genuine and significant. The concerns he had raised about unchecked government surveillance, about the reliability of recordings, about the need for judicial oversight, these concerns were eventually recognized as legitimate by courts and legislatures. Johnson's legal battle over the surveillance recording represented a form of resistance that was strategic rather than simply reactive. He had not merely objected to the recording's use at trial, he had forced the government to produce the actual tape rather than accepting a transcript. He had exposed the destruction or deterioration of the evidence. He had used the legal proceedings to raise broader questions about surveillance practices. He had mobilized community support to create political pressure for reform. Each of these actions had contributed to weakening the government's case and to advancing broader principles about privacy rights and limitations on government power. The recording that was never played in court became, paradoxically, more significant because it was never played. Its absence became evidence of government misconduct or incompetence. Its exclusion became a precedent for challenging surveillance evidence. Its supposed destruction became a rallying point for those concerned about unchecked government power. The gap where the recording should have been, the silence where Johnson's voice should have sounded, spoke more loudly than the actual words on the tape ever could have, and This was perhaps the most important lesson from Johnson's experience, that power could be exercised not only through direct action, but through strategic exploitation of procedural rules, technical requirements, and legal principles. That challenging how evidence was gathered could be as effective as challenging what the evidence showed. That forcing the government to follow its own rules could create opportunities for resistance even when the government possessed overwhelming resources and authority. When Johnson died in July 1968, the obituaries in Harlem's newspapers mentioned his criminal conviction, but also his legal battle over surveillance. He was remembered as someone who had fought the government not just through violence or intimidation, which were the traditional tools of criminal organizations, but through law, through community organizing, through raising public awareness about civil liberties issues. This aspect of his legacy influenced how subsequent generations thought about resistance to state power, about the importance of legal rights, about the value of procedural protections even for those accused of crimes. The surveillance recording that was never played remained a symbol of both the reach and the limitations of government power. It demonstrated that technology had given the state new capabilities to monitor and control, but it also demonstrated that those capabilities were constrained by law, by procedure, by the requirement that evidence be properly preserved and authenticated. The recording's absence from Johnson's trial stood as testament to the principle that even the powerful government of the United States could be held accountable to rules, and that intelligent resistance to state overreach could succeed even when the odds seemed insurmountable.